27 ships? That is the number U.S. Central Command itself put out in a single sentence on its official account. Since the start of the naval blockade against Iranian ports and coastal areas, U.S. forces have directed 27 vessels to turn around or sent them back toward an Iranian port they had already left. No warning shots in that sentence, no missiles, just ships turned in the water, one after another, by American warships sitting across the routes into Iran. That is the moment this story is built around, and it did not happen in isolation. It happened after months of buildup, a war, a ceasefire, a broken ceasefire, and a fight over one of the most important stretches of water on the planet. To understand why 27 ships being turned around is a big deal, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, and what it means when the world's most powerful navy decides to physically stand between merchant ships and Iranian docks. Start with the geography, because the geography is the whole reason any of this matters. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow channel of water separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the open ocean. At its narrowest point, it is only about 33 kilometers wide, with the actual shipping lanes squeezed into a fraction of that. And through that narrow gap passes something like a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade, and roughly a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas. Tankers moving crude from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iran itself all funnel through this one corridor. There is no shortcut. If you want to move Gulf oil to global markets by sea, in most cases, you go through the Strait of Hormuz, or you do not go at all. That is why a blockade here is not a regional story. It is an energy story, an inflation story, and in 2026, it became a war story. Before this became a story about ports and blockades, it was already a story about oil prices, and it is worth pausing on that too. Trading economics data from the very start of the crisis in early March 2026 showed West Texas Intermediate crude surging nearly 6% in a single session, climbing towards $71 a barrel, the highest level in almost a year, as shipping companies began rerouting vessels away from the strait as a precaution. Within days, that same benchmark had jumped again, this time by roughly 15%, with Brent crude futures rising more than $15 to over $108 a barrel. According to Reuters, reporting picked up by financial outlets tracking the crisis in real time, Iraq and Kuwait both cut oil production during that stretch, compounding cuts already underway in Qatari liquefied natural gas exports. By the time the Congressional Research Service compiled its own analysis months later, it noted that global oil prices had risen by 50% between February and May of 2026 alone, a staggering figure for a commodity that underpins transportation and manufacturing costs across the entire world economy. Even the direction of that pressure has swung sharply at different moments. In one especially dramatic swing on March 11th, oil prices actually plunged, WTI falling more than 8.5% in a single session after reports emerged that Trump was considering direct U.S. military action to seize control of the strait itself and force it back open, a move markets apparently read as more likely to stabilize supply than prolong the standoff. The infrastructure hit during this period tells its own story about how targeted this conflict became. Iranian retaliatory strikes, according to energy market analysis from Kepler and other trackers, targeted three of the most strategically significant export nodes in the entire Gulf region: Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG terminal, one of the largest single-site liquefied natural gas export facilities on the planet, Saudi Arabia's Yanbu refining and export complex on the Red Sea, and the UAE's Fujairah export hub, a critical tanker transit and bunkering point positioned just outside the strait itself. Saudi Arabia's own Ras Tanura refinery, the kingdom's largest, was forced to temporarily suspend operations after being hit by a drone strike in early March, and falling debris from a separate intercepted drone triggered a fire at the Fujairah oil trading hub around the same time. Tanker traffic through the strait, according to industry analysis, collapsed to below 10% of its normal operating capacity within weeks of the conflict escalating. In response, Saudi Arabia activated its east-west pipeline to Yanbu at close to maximum capacity, somewhere between 4 and 4.5 million barrels a day of export capacity that bypasses the strait entirely, while the UAE leaned on its own Fujairah-linked pipeline to keep roughly 1.5 million barrels a day moving without ever touching Hormuz. Neither workaround came close to replacing the estimated 15 million barrels a day the strait normally carries, which is exactly why, even with pipelines running flat out, the broader region still felt the squeeze. The chain of events that led to 27 ships being turned back at gunpoint essentially starts on February 28, 2026. On that day, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of airstrikes against Iranian military and government targets. Among the dead, according to multiple reports that followed, was Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, killed in what has since been described as a targeted assassination. Alongside him, a large number of senior military and government officials were killed, and a significant amount of Iranian military infrastructure was destroyed in the opening days of that campaign. Iran did not sit still. It responded with missile and drone strikes against Israel, against American bases scattered across the Middle East, and against countries in the region seen as aligned with Washington. And it did something else, something with much longer economic consequences. It closed the Strait of Hormuz to foreign shipping. This closure was not just a political statement. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, began transmitting direct warnings over VHF radio to vessels approaching the strait, telling them in plain terms that no ship was allowed to pass. Britain's Royal Navy responded by saying the closure had no legal standing under international maritime law, but added that safety in the strait could not be guaranteed while Iranian forces were actively threatening vessels. That distinction, legal versus safe, mattered less to shipping companies than you might think. Insurance premiums for tankers in the region spiked. Some vessels stayed in port rather than risk the transit. Others turned back mid-voyage. Within days, one of the busiest choke points on Earth had effectively gone quiet, and the ripple effects moved through global oil markets almost immediately. The fighting between the U.S., Israel, and Iran continued through March and into early April of 2026, and it was brutal by any measure. Axios reported that on March 1st alone, Trump claimed the United States had destroyed 9 Iranian warships, part of a broader campaign to clear Iranian naval assets away from the strait. Iranian forces, meanwhile, were laying sea mines, attacking merchant ships directly, and in some cases, boarding vessels they considered non-compliant with their directives. The human cost climbed steadily during this period. Tracking data compiled during the crisis documented at least 1 tugboat sunk, at least 17 merchant ships damaged, with 7 of those so badly hit that their crews abandoned them entirely. 2 merchant ships captured outright, 12 seafarers killed or reported missing, and 1 port worker killed with 2 more wounded in an incident in Bahrain. These are not abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. Each one represents a ship's crew that woke up one morning expecting a normal transit and instead found themselves in the middle of a live naval conflict. By early April, the pressure had built to the point where President Trump issued one of the starkest threats of the entire crisis. He warned that, in his words, quote, "A whole civilization will die tonight," unquote, if Iran did not agree to end the war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Hours after that warning, on April 7th, a 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran was announced, brokered with Pakistan acting as the mediator. Iran's foreign minister at the time, Abbas Araghchi, confirmed Iran's side of the agreement, saying Tehran would accept the ceasefire if attacks against Iran were halted. On April 8th, the ceasefire officially took hold, and U.S. officials, including the American official then serving as Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, stated publicly that the Strait of Hormuz was expected to reopen to commercial shipping, with Iran agreeing to allow safe passage as part of the truce framework. For a moment, it looked like the crisis might actually be winding down. It was not. The ceasefire held for about 2 weeks, roughly the length it was designed for, but the underlying dispute over who actually controls access to the Strait of Hormuz never went away. Talks between the United States and Iran, held in Islamabad, Pakistan, were supposed to convert that temporary ceasefire into something more permanent. They failed. And when they failed, President Trump did not hesitate. According to the Congressional Research Service, on April 13, 2026, Trump ordered a full U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, blocking ships from leaving or entering, with one carved-out exception for humanitarian aid shipments. This is the operation that, months later, would produce that now famous CENTCOM line about 27 vessels turned around. The blockade did not begin quietly. Al Jazeera reported that the U.S. military had explicitly threatened to blockade all Iranian ports starting that Monday, and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps responded immediately, stating that any approaching military vessels would be treated as a breach of the ceasefire agreement, and warning they would, quote, be dealt with severely, unquote. Interestingly, CENTCOM's actual public posture ended up being narrower than Trump's initial rhetoric. Trump had floated the idea of blockading the entire strait and going after any ship paying tolls to Iran. CENTCOM's own statement scaled that back, saying U.S. forces would not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. In other words, the blockade, as actually enforced, targeted traffic specifically tied to Iranian ports and coastal areas, not the strait as a whole. That distinction is important because it is exactly the operation that produced the 27-ship figure. The blockade officially began at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on April 13th, and it applied only to ships going to or from Iran. Iran, for its part, treated the mere presence of U.S. military vessels near the strait as a ceasefire violation in itself, regardless of what those vessels were or were not blocking. By April 18th, just 5 days in, CENTCOM stated it had already intercepted a total of 23 vessels attempting to breach the restrictions. The number kept climbing from there. And somewhere in the days that followed, CENTCOM issued the statement this entire story hinges on, that U.S. forces had directed 27 vessels to turn around or return to an Iranian port since the blockade began. Not every account of the numbers lines up perfectly, and it is worth being honest about that rather than smoothing it over. Lloyd's List, the maritime industry's most established tracking publication, reported that, by April 20th, at least 26 ships had managed to bypass the American blockade line entirely, moving in both directions, toward Iranian ports and away from them. So you had two things happening at once, according to two different sources. CENTCOM was reporting a rising tally of vessels it had successfully turned back, 23, then 27, and eventually climbing much higher over the following weeks. And Lloyd's List was separately reporting that a comparable number of ships were slipping through anyway. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. A blockade rarely achieves 100% enforcement, especially across a body of water with this much traffic and this many flag states involved. The honest picture is one of partial contested control, not a hermetically sealed border. What is not in dispute is the economic bite. U.S. Officials at the time claimed the blockade was costing Iran roughly $500 million a day in lost trade and oil revenue. That is the kind of number that, if even directionally accurate, starts to genuinely strain a government's finances, especially when already under heavy sanctions pressure and already funding a live, multi-front conflict. Iran did not simply absorb that pressure passively. In retaliation, Iranian forces seized 2 cargo ships of their own during this period, a direct tit for the response that underscored how quickly this had become a shadow war fought through commercial shipping, rather than just missiles and airstrikes. The United States, aware that the blockade was creating serious headaches for global shipping companies who had nothing to do with Iran, tried to soften the disruption. On May 3, 2026, Trump announced what he called Project Freedom, an initiative to help mariners navigate around the crisis by using a southern route that avoided Iranian waters altogether. It was, in effect, an attempt to keep global trade moving, while the standoff over the strait itself continued unresolved. Around the same time, Wayao Navy Vice Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command and the Fifth Fleet, oversaw an enormous buildup of military assets in the region. Reporting at the time described more than 15,000 U.S. military personnel deployed in support of the operation, over 200 aircraft, and roughly 20 warships, including aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, amphibious assault ships, and persistent surveillance aircraft. This was not a token presence. This was one of the largest coordinated American naval deployments to the Gulf in years, built specifically around choking off Iranian maritime trade, while, at least officially, staying inside the boundary of not blocking non-Iranian shipping through the strait. Then, on June 14th, something shifted. The United States and Iran signed a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, and as part of that agreement, the naval blockade was lifted. After roughly 2 months of ships being turned back, intercepted, disabled, and in some cases boarded, the pressure on Iranian ports eased. Iranian oil exports, which had reportedly dropped dramatically during the blockade period, began to recover. For a few weeks, the story of the Strait of Hormuz shifted away from confrontation and toward a fragile, negotiated stability. Part of what made that June stability possible was a coordinated effort to clear out the backlog of ships and sailors who had been stuck in the region for weeks. The International Maritime Organization, working alongside Oman, organized what was described as an evacuation in late June 2026, guiding long-trapped mariners out through Omani waters, south of both Iranian territorial waters and the traditional Hormuz shipping lanes, according to the Congressional Research Service's account of the period. Following the June 14th Memorandum of Understanding, crossings through the region did tick back up, though notably, they never returned to pre-war averages, a sign that confidence in the route's safety remained shaky even during the calmest weeks of the year. That stability did not last. Iran, as part of asserting its own claim over the waterway, began requiring vessels transiting the strait to use a specific route through Iranian territorial waters starting June 19th, designating it the only, quote, safe passage, unquote, according to CNN's ongoing coverage of the crisis. This was Iran using the strait itself as leverage, essentially telling international shipping that if you want a guaranteed safe transit, you go through our route, on our terms. Predictably, not every shipping company complied, and Iran did not treat noncompliance lightly. Iranian forces began firing on vessels attempting to use alternative routes through the strait that had not been authorized under Tehran's new framework. That pattern of attacks, and the American military response to them, is what ultimately broke the ceasefire entirely. The specific breaking points can actually be traced to 2 dates. On June 25th, 2026, just days after that IMO and Oman coordinated evacuation route opened, Iran attacked a ship in Omani waters, prompting immediate U.S. airstrikes in response. Then on July 7th and 8th, Iranian forces carried out another round of attacks, this time on ships off the coast of Oman, which triggered a further wave of U.S. airstrikes. It was after that second round of attacks that President Trump stated the Memorandum of Understanding was no longer in force, effectively declaring the ceasefire dead weeks before it was formally acknowledged as such. This detail matters, because it shows the collapse was not a single dramatic event, but a short, specific sequence: an evacuation route opening, an attack near Oman, U.S. retaliation, and then a second attack barely 2 weeks later that finished off whatever was left of the truce. By July 10th, President Trump stated that while the U.S. remained willing to continue talks with Iran, Washington had formally informed Tehran that the ceasefire was no longer in effect. Iran's chief negotiator at the time, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, responded by saying Tehran was prepared for what he called, quote, all-out defense, unquote, if the United States broke the agreement. The following day, Iran's foreign minister accused Washington of violating a clause in their agreement tied to Iran's nuclear program. And on July 12th, the IRGC announced it had closed the Strait of Hormuz once again, this time after firing a warning shot at a vessel attempting to use one of those unauthorized routes. The U.S. military responded with additional strikes on Iranian targets, while continuing to insist publicly that the strait itself remained open for international traffic. 2 days later, on July 14th, the United States restarted its maritime blockade against Iran. NPR's coverage at the time captured the moment clearly, describing the U.S. military as having, quote, begun its blockade of ships entering or exiting Iran's ports, unquote, even as Iran vowed to assert its own control over the strait. The blockade officially resumed at 11:30 p.m. Tehran time on July 14th, and this time, CENTCOM's public reporting became almost a running tally, updated every few days, tracked closely by journalists, analysts, and shipping insurers watching the numbers climb. 17 hours after the blockade resumed, CENTCOM announced its forces had intercepted and redirected 2 commercial vessels attempting to enter Iranian waters. That was the starting point of round 2. By July 25th, CENTCOM stated it had redirected 12 commercial vessels, disabled 2 that had refused to comply, and boarded 2 more to verify their cargo and compliance. One of the specific incidents named in that update involved the Comoros flag tanker MT Charminar, boarded and verified in the Arabian Sea before being allowed to continue its journey, and the Mozambique flag tanker MT Levine, disabled in the Gulf of Oman after its crew reportedly ignored repeated warnings and attempted to violate the blockade multiple times. By July 29th, the number had risen again, 20 commercial vessels redirected, with the same 2 disabled and 2 boarded holding steady. By August 3rd, CENTCOM's figure had jumped to 44 commercial vessels, redirected, alongside the 2 disabled and 2 boarded. It is worth pausing here to notice the shape of that curve because it tells its own story. 2 vessels in the first 17 hours. 12 by day 11, 20 by day 15, 44 by day 20. That is not a blockade that is winding down. That is a blockade that is being tested repeatedly by shipping traffic still trying to reach or leave Iranian ports, and being enforced, apparently with growing intensity, by American naval forces sitting across those approaches. Somewhere in this stretch of rising numbers sits the 27-vessel figure that gives this story its title, a specific CENTCOM confirmed milestone in an operation that, by early August, had more than doubled that number. Throughout this second phase of the blockade, CENTCOM also emphasized the scale of the force behind the numbers. The command stated that more than 20 U.S. warships were deployed to the Middle East in support of ongoing military missions, explicitly including what it called strict enforcement of the blockade against Iran. This is not a handful of patrol boats loosely monitoring shipping lanes. This is a significant portion of the U.S. Navy's regional presence, organized specifically around controlling access to Iranian ports, day after day, vessel after vessel. Iran's response to this second blockade has been anything but quiet. Mohsen Rezaiei, a military advisor to Iran's current supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, stated publicly that Iran's armed forces would not, quote, stand idly by, unquote, and allow the American naval blockade to continue. In an interview broadcast on Iranian state television, Rezaiei went further, insisting that Iran would, quote, under no circumstances allow any route through the Strait of Hormuz other than Iran's route to be opened, unquote, and added a direct warning that if the United States brought warships into what he called the illegal route in the strait, Iran would target them. That is about as unambiguous a threat as a senior Iranian official can make on state television, and it should be treated with appropriate seriousness. It also, notably, comes from Iranian state media, which means it should be understood as Tehran's stated position and messaging, not verified as a guaranteed course of action, but as a real and repeated public threat from a named Iranian official. The diplomatic track has not completely collapsed, even amid all this. Iran and Oman have continued talks aimed at establishing what has been described as a Malacca Strait-style framework. a reference to the internationally managed shipping lane between Malaysia and Indonesia as a model for a temporary safe route through Hormuz that both sides might accept. Separately, the United Nations International Maritime Organization, working with Oman, has proposed its own alternative route, hugging the Omani coastline south of the strait. Iran, for its part, has accused Oman of opening that route under pressure from Washington, which gives you a sense of how tangled the diplomacy around this single stretch of water has become. Regional mediators have also floated a 10-day ceasefire proposal aimed at putting the original Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding back on track, though, as of the most recent reporting, that proposal remains unconfirmed by either Washington or Tehran. The war has not stayed confined to shipping and naval maneuvering either. Iran's foreign ministry has stated publicly that the United States has, in its words, disregarded the ceasefire from its inception, while Trump, in comments to radio host Hugh Hewitt, described the Memorandum of Understanding as, quote, sort of a test, and they weren't there, unquote, suggesting he viewed Iran as having failed to meet its obligations under the agreement from the start. On the American side, House Republicans have introduced a $95 billion funding bill tied to the Iran war, covering military operations, agricultural aid tied to economic fallout, and election-related spending, a sign that the financial and political scale of this conflict has grown well beyond a limited regional skirmish. There have also been documented human rights concerns running alongside the military conflict. Iran Human Rights, a monitoring organization tracking executions inside Iran, reported that the Iranian government had executed at least 47 political prisoners during 2026, a rate the organization described as nearly 3 times higher than at the same point the previous year. That is a separate but related thread in this story, a domestic crackdown running in parallel with an external military and economic confrontation. And it is worth noting as part of the full picture, even though it sits outside the direct question of ships and ports. Environmental fallout has entered the picture as well. Oman's Environment Authority issued a warning that an oil spill from a sanctioned tanker carrying Russian crude had reached beaches at Ras Madraka in the southeast of the country. Oman said it had deployed specialized teams to monitor the spill and limit its spread. CNN's own reporting has separately highlighted the potentially devastating environmental impacts of oil spills in and around the Strait of Hormuz and the wider Persian Gulf, a risk that grows every time tankers are forced into contested or unfamiliar routes to avoid naval confrontation. And the disruption has not stayed limited to the Gulf itself. Houthi officials in Yemen have said they are prepared to close the Red Sea, the primary alternative shipping route to Hormuz, if the broader conflict continues, which would effectively remove the fallback option that global shipping has been leaning on whenever Hormuz becomes too dangerous. As for where things stand most recently, CNN's live coverage from August 12, 2026, just one day before this was being reported, described Trump insisting that the United States controls the Strait of Hormuz, while Iran responded that it could, in its own words, prolong the war with the United States rather than back down. Days earlier, on August 5th, Trump had said the strait would reopen, quote, soon, unquote, or he would launch what he described as a harsh new attack on Iran that is the state of play right now. Not a resolved crisis, not a clean American victory. A live, contested standoff still measured week by week in the number of ships redirected, disabled, or boarded, with CENTCOM's tally climbing past 40, past the 27 that first defined this operation, and either side showing clear signs of backing away from its position on who actually controls access to Iranian ports and the waterway around them. Stepping back from the day-by-day numbers, it's worth asking what this pattern actually tells us. A blockade against Iranian ports that starts, pauses, and restarts, twice now within a single year, is not a sign of a fully controlled situation on either side. If the United States had absolute control over access to the Strait of Hormuz and Iranian ports, you would not need a running CENTCOM tally updated every few days, because there would be nothing left to intercept. And if Iran had genuinely reasserted full control over its own coastline and the waters around it, the blockade could not have resumed a second time, and immediately started producing new interceptions within 17 hours. What the numbers actually describe is a contest, an ongoing test of wills fought through tankers, cargo ships, and the crews caught in between, with 27 and now 44, and likely more vessels by the time this reaches you, as the running scoreboard of that contest. It is also worth being clear about what remains genuinely unverified or contested in all of this, rather than presenting every figure as settled fact. The overall Wikipedia-tracked summary of the operation lists a total of 85 vessels intercepted by CENTCOM's own count across the full duration of the blockade, alongside 3 ships seized outright. But the Congressional Research Service, drawing on its own review, describes the initial blockade phase alone as having redirected over 140 ships and disabled 9, a noticeably different figure covering a narrower window of time. Lloyd's List's claim that 26 ships bypassed the blockade by April 20th sits alongside, not necessarily in agreement with, CENTCOM's own intercept numbers from the same period. These are not necessarily contradictions in the sense of one side lying and another telling the truth. They often reflect different counting methods, different time windows, and different incentives. A military command emphasizing its enforcement success, a shipping industry tracker emphasizing how much traffic is still getting through despite that enforcement. The honest approach is to hold both sets of numbers at once, rather than collapsing them into a single, tidy total. Similarly, claims made by Iranian officials on Iranian state television, including Mohsen Rezaei's direct threat to target American warships if they enter what he called Iran's route through the Strait, should be understood as exactly that, a stated position from a named Iranian official broadcast through Iranian state media. It reflects Tehran's declared posture and should be taken seriously as a signal of intent, but it is not, on its own, independent confirmation of any specific military action that has or has not occurred. The same caution applies to the $500 million per day cost figure attributed to U.S. officials describing the blockade's impact on Iran, a claim that comes from the American side of this conflict and has not been independently verified through Iranian financial data or a neutral third-party audit. What can be said with confidence, because it comes directly from CENTCOM's own public statements, is this. The United States did impose a naval blockade against Iranian ports twice, in April and again in July of 2026. That blockade did result in a documented, officially announced figure of 27 vessels being turned around or sent back toward Iranian ports at one identifiable point in the operation. That figure grew substantially in the weeks that followed, reaching over 40 commercial vessels redirected by early August, according to CENTCOM's own running updates. And the underlying dispute driving all of it, who controls passage through the Strait of Hormuz, remains, as of the most recent reporting, entirely unresolved. To be fully transparent about where this reporting comes from, the core facts in this script are drawn from named checkable sources. U.S. Central Command's own public statements, including the specific 27-vessel figure and the later running tallies through early August. Reporting from NPR, CNN, Axios, and Al Jazeera covering the war's origins, the ceasefire, its collapse, and the blockade's two separate phases. The Congressional Research Service, part of the Library of Congress, providing an independent government analysis of the blockade's timeline and economic impact. Lloyd's List, the maritime industry's primary tracking publication, for its independent count of vessels bypassing the blockade. And direct statements from named officials on both sides, including President Trump, then Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, Vice Admiral Brad Cooper, Iranian negotiator Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and military advisor Mohsen Rezaei. Where figures from these sources diverged, that divergence has been flagged rather than smoothed over, and where a claim originates specifically from one side's own state media or official statements, that origin has been noted rather than presented as independently confirmed fact. So where does that leave things right now, today? A blockade that has already turned back dozens of ships, a strait that carries a quarter of the world's oil trade, sitting at the center of a standoff between two governments that have already fought a direct war this year, and a running number, updated every few days by CENTCOM itself, that shows no sign of stopping. 27 was just one data point in a story that is still being written in real time, off the coast of Iran, one intercepted ship at a time. What do you think happens next here? Does this kind of blockade actually force a resolution over the Strait of Hormuz? Or does it just become another prolonged standoff that quietly resets every few months, the way this one already has, twice? Let us know your take in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we will keep tracking this one as it develops.